Tonight, on the Midnight Drive, we're bringing this entire week together. From throwing salt over your shoulder to knocking on wood to saying, bless you, after a sneeze, to horoscopes, manifestations, lucky objects, and signs from the universe. We've been looking at superstition from every angle. But maybe none of these behaviors are actually about luck. Maybe they're about something much deeper. Tonight, we're looking at why people create rituals in the first place. Because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Randomness feels cold. And when people don't know what happens next, they reach for patterns, for meaning, for reassurance. Even if it only comes from the feeling that they're doing something instead of nothing. See, one of the strangest things about superstition is how easy it is to recognize in other people. Not in yourself. Someone carries a lucky coin, for instance. Someone refuses to walk under a ladder. Someone checks their horoscope before a first date. And immediately, it feels irrational. Easy to dismiss. But superstition becomes more complicated when you stop looking at the specific belief and start looking at the behavior underneath it. Because once you do that, a pattern starts to emerge. A person spills salt and immediately throws some of it over their left shoulder. Not because they fully believe an evil spirit is standing there, waiting for seasoning, but because the moment suddenly feels wrong, unresolved, like something small shifted and needs to be corrected. Someone says, hopefully nothing goes wrong tomorrow, and then immediately knocks on wood. Again, not always from deep belief, sometimes almost automatically. The instinct is still there. A statement is made. A possibility is acknowledged. And suddenly, it feels dangerous to leave the moment alone. So something gets added, a gesture, a correction, a response. That structure repeats constantly. A baseball player wears the same socks during a winning streak. A student uses the same pencil for every exam. A person avoids saying something positive out loud because they're afraid they'll jinx it. The details change. The emotional structure underneath it all doesn't. Something uncertain is approaching, and behavior changes in response to it. That's the important part, because uncertainty changes people, even small amounts of it. Especially when the outcome matters on an emotional level. A relationship, a diagnosis, a flight, maybe it's a job interview. Anything where the result isn't fully controlled. That's where superstition starts becoming visible. Not because people suddenly stop being rational, but because uncertainty creates tension. And the mind wants to reduce that tension. That's what these behaviors actually do. Not control the outcome. Control the feeling surrounding the outcome. That's the distinction that matters, because most superstitions aren't really attempts to alter reality. They're attempts to feel less powerless while reality unfolds. And honestly, that's about as human as it gets, isn't it? Because randomness feels terrible emotionally. Not intellectually, emotionally. People can understand probability perfectly and still feel deeply uncomfortable when outcomes feel uncontrolled. That's why patterns become so important. The brain naturally searches for them. Not because the brain is broken, because pattern recognition is actually very useful. It's one of the main ways that humans survive. The problem is the brain would often rather find a false pattern than accept complete randomness. Because randomness offers absolutely no reassurance. It offers no meaning. And it offers no sense that the events connect together in a manageable way. Superstition fills that gap. It creates emotional structure. A person sneezes and someone says, "Bless you." A person yawns and covers their mouth. A person sees repeating numbers everywhere. 111, 112, 113. The one that I see most often is the classic 1, 2, 3, 4 on a clock. Often, I'll see it twice a day. Suddenly, those numbers feel charged with meaning. Not because there's evidence that they are, but because the mind connected them to a feeling. And once emotion enters the pattern becomes much harder to dismiss. That's why coincidences feel so powerful, especially emotional coincidences. You think about someone and they text you. You keep hearing the same phrase repeatedly from different places. You have a strong feeling about something, and then something unusual happens afterward. Objectively, these things are happening constantly, but subjectively, they feel very different, don't they? Because the brain notices emotionally relevant patterns more intensely. And once a pattern feels meaningful, people start organizing behavior around it. That's where superstition grows. It's not from stupidity. It's from emotional reinforcement. A behavior gets linked to relief, or luck, or safety. And once that link forms, the behavior starts repeating. That's why rituals become so sticky. Even when people know logically, the action itself doesn't change reality. An athlete knows the lucky socks are not controlling the game. A person knows knocking on wood does not alter the future. A person knows Mercury being in retrograde probably isn't responsible for their horrible week. But the behavior persists anyway, because the ritual itself changes something internal. It creates the feeling of participation. The feeling that you're not completely passive, that you're the one that's doing something. And that feeling matters more than most people realize, because helplessness is deeply uncomfortable. People struggle emotionally when they feel disconnected from outcomes. So what do? We create systems, small behaviors, small protections, small corrections, ways of interacting with uncertainty that make the waiting feel more manageable. That's why superstition never disappeared, because uncertainty never disappeared. Consider this: as long as people hope, fear, wait, anticipate, love, grieve, they're going to search for patterns. They're going to search for rituals. They're going to look for signs that things are going to be okay. And maybe that's the important realization, that superstition was never really about magic. Not completely. Maybe it was always more about discomfort, about uncertainty, about the deep human need to feel connected to what happens next, even if that connection only exists inside the ritual itself. What do you make of this? Let us know in the comments below wherever you're listening. You're listening to the midnight drive. If superstition was only about ancient rituals, it probably would have disappeared a long time ago. But it didn't, because the instinct behind it kept adapting. People stopped worrying about evil spirits hiding behind spilled salt and started worrying about energy, alignment, vibrations. The language modernized. The structure underneath it did not. That's what makes modern superstition so interesting. It rarely presents itself as superstition anymore. It sounds personal now. It sounds reflective. Sometimes it even sounds therapeutic. A person says, "I just feel like the universe is trying to tell me something." Or, "I think I'm attracting negative energy lately." Or, "Everything's been off since Mercury went into retrograde." And what's fascinating is how normal those phrases sound now. Working in retail, we always make jokes when there's a full moon out. I mean, granted, I'm a piano player at the department store that I work at, but there is definitely a vibe shift. And we always just attribute it to a full moon. Somebody will check it. Sure enough, there it is. And what's fascinating, again, is how normal that has become. It's a shared experience. It's not fringe. It's not unusual. It's just a part of everyday conversation in the break room. That shift matters because it shows how superstition evolved alongside modern culture. Older superstitions were often external. Protect yourself from something outside of you. Throw salt, knock on wood, avoid certain numbers. Modern superstition often feels internalized. Your thoughts shape outcomes. Your mindset attracts experiences. Your energy affects what enters your life. Again, some of these ideas contain real emotional truth. Mindset absolutely influences behavior. Stress absolutely affects your perception. And confidence absolutely changes the way that you make decisions. Those things are very real. But then the idea stretches beyond psychology into something more uncertain. Thoughts become magnetic. Coincidences become signs. Patterns become messages. And suddenly, the structure starts looking very familiar again. The idea that uncertainty isn't really random. That there's some deeper system underneath all of the events. Something responding to you on a personal level. That is the emotional appeal to all of it. Because again, randomness feels emotionally unsatisfying. It's destabilizing. People want life to feel connected, intentional, even when it hurts. That's why phrases like, "everything happens for a reason," become so powerful. Not because they explain suffering logically. It's actually a pretty offensive phrase if you use that phrase. If that's your catchphrase for funerals or anytime you're interacting with people who are grieving, it's not a good one to have in your hip pocket. It's something that gets used to soften, with good intention, the emotional impact of uncertainty. If something painful has meaning, it feels easier to survive. If something difficult is somehow part of a lesson, it feels less chaotic. And that instinct runs deep. And social media amplified it all dramatically because modern algorithms reward emotional certainty. Have you noticed that? Short, Emotionally charged ideas spread so much faster than nuance ever will. The universe removed them from your life for a reason. If you keep seeing this video, it's a sign. Your energy creates your reality. See, those statements feel personal immediately. They collapse randomness into meaning. And once meaning enters the picture, people become emotionally invested. That's why modern superstition spreads so effectively online. Not because people are irrational, but because uncertainty is exhausting. Especially now. People live inside constant instability. Economic instability, social instability, relationship instability. The future is changing constantly. And when uncertainty increases, pattern seeking increases too. That's predictable because the mind wants orientation. It wants to know where things are headed, what events mean, how outcomes connect together. And when those answers are not available, people create frameworks to fill the gap. Astrology becomes orientation. Manifestation becomes orientation. Signs from the universe become orientation. Not because they're scientifically verified, but because they reduce emotional ambiguity. They create a narrative. And narrative is very comforting. Think about it. A breakup. That wasn't random. A coincidence. That wasn't random. A difficult season. That wasn't random. Everything becomes part of a larger pattern. That's emotionally stabilizing. It provides the illusion of control, even if it's not objectively provable. And honestly, that emotional stabilization may be the real point. Because people don't always search for beliefs that are perfectly accurate. Sometimes they search for beliefs that are emotionally survivable. Beliefs that make uncertainty feel less hostile, less cold, less meaningless. That's where modern superstition becomes difficult to untangle. Because it often exists in that strange middle space between psychology and magical thinking. A person carries crystals because they feel calmer. A person checks tarot cards because it helps them reflect. A person reads horoscopes because they want reassurance. The behavior itself may genuinely reduce anxiety. And that's okay. That part is real. But the emotional structure underneath of it all still follows the same ancient pattern. A person facing uncertainty searches for meaning, searches for orientation, searches for the feeling that outcomes aren't completely disconnected from them. That instinct hasn't changed in literally thousands of years. Only the symbols changed, only the vocabulary changed. And once you start seeing that, modern life begins looking very different. Because superstition isn't hiding in obscure rituals anymore. It's integrated into culture itself, into language, into social media, into how people talk about relationships, success, failure, coincidence, and their own identity. And maybe that's why superstition never truly disappears, because uncertainty never disappears. What do you make of that? You're listening to The Midnight Drive. One of the biggest reasons that superstition survives is because it works emotionally. Not objectively, not scientifically, but emotionally. Because people often assume superstition exists because people are uninformed. But that's usually not true. Plenty of intelligent people engage in superstitious behavior. People who fully understand probability. People who understand psychology. People who know logically that their ritual probably isn't influencing the outcome of anything. And yet, they still do it. That's the interesting part, isn't it? Because superstition isn't always trying to solve uncertainty in a logical way. It's trying to survive uncertainty emotionally. Those are two very different things. A person waiting for medical results might wear a lucky jacket. A pilot might follow the exact same pre-flight routine every single time. An athlete might refuse to change anything during a winning streak. Not because they truly believe the object controls reality, but because the ritual changes how uncertainty feels. That's what people underestimate. Ritual creates emotional stability. Have you ever noticed that? Ritual creates emotional stability. It creates predictability. It creates a sense of structure inside situations that otherwise feel uncontrolled. It gives just a small element of control back to you. That's why rituals appear so strongly during stress. Not just superstitious rituals, all rituals. Funerals, weddings, religious services. Moments where uncertainty or emotional intensity become overwhelming. Those moments often trigger structured behavior. Because again, structure calms people. Predictable actions reduce emotional chaos. And once we have that straight, superstition starts looking less strange. Not because the beliefs become objectively true or that the beliefs suddenly start making some kind of magical sense, but because the emotional purpose becomes so much easier to see. Take prayer, for example. Not prayer as personal reflection, but transactional prayer. Big difference. Big difference. What is transactional prayer, you might be wondering? If I do this, maybe fill in the blank outcome will change. Or if I pray hard enough, maybe things will work out in my favor. Again, this isn't about attacking any kind of belief. It's about recognizing structure, because structurally, that's very close to superstition. An action is being connected to an uncertain outcome, not symbolically, directly. And that structure appears everywhere. Lucky necklaces, pregame rituals, manifestation boards, repeating affirmations, checking horoscopes before making any decisions, trying not to speak negativity into existence. Even phrases like, "Don't put that energy out there." All of it follows the same emotional architecture. The belief that actions, thoughts, or behaviors might influence uncertain outcomes. And to some degree, people need that feeling. Because complete helplessness is psychologically brutal. Humans struggle when they feel disconnected from outcomes. When they feel entirely passive, entirely exposed to randomness. So, they create points of participation. Small ways of interacting with uncertainty. That's what superstition often is at its core. Participation. The feeling that you're not just waiting helplessly while reality unfolds itself around you. Even something tiny can create that feeling. A ritual, a phrase, a repeated behavior. And once the ritual reduces anxiety once, all it takes is once, it becomes emotionally reinforced. And that's how habits form. Not because they're objectively effective necessarily, but because they create emotional relief. A person knocks on wood, and nothing bad happens afterward. Now, the ritual feels connected to safety, even if the connection is coincidence. A person checks a horoscope, and one sentence feels strangely accurate. Now the system feels personally relevant. Again, not because it's proven, but because it created emotional resonance. That's why emotionally charged coincidences become so powerful. People remember the hits, not the misses. They remember the tarot reading that felt accurate, not the dozens of vague readings that didn't. They remember the gut feeling that turned out right, not all the times the intuition failed completely. That selective reinforcement strengthens the pattern because emotionally significant outcomes stand out more vividly. Once a pattern feels emotionally real, people start building identity around it. Have you ever heard somebody say, I'm intuitive, I'm spiritual, I'm sensitive to energy? Sometimes that one comes out as, I'm an empath. Again, I'm not mocking anybody here. I'm just observing how quickly humans build narrative from emotional experience. Because narratives create orientation. It tells people who they are, what events mean, how they relate to uncertainty. And uncertainty, again, is exhausting without any kind of narrative. That's why people seek systems. Not necessarily because they want deception, but because they want coherence. A way to emotionally organize experiences that otherwise felt disconnected. That instinct explains so much human behavior, not just superstition. Religion, conspiracy thinking, ritual behavior, compulsive routines, even certain forms of self-help culture, all of them offer structure inside of uncertainty. A framework that transforms randomness into something interpretable, something manageable, something that feels less emotionally hostile. And honestly, that emotional need may never disappear completely because uncertainty itself never disappears completely. What kind of superstitions are you holding on to? I would absolutely love to hear all about them. Please leave us a comment below wherever you might be listening. We always love having you along right here on the Midnight Drive. After looking at all of this, all of the things we've been talking about superstition this week, the strange thing about superstition in general is that it starts becoming harder to separate from ordinary human behavior. Because once you strip away the specific symbols, the same emotional pattern keeps appearing. Again, a person spills salt and throws some over their shoulder. A person says something hopeful out loud. Why would they say something hopeful? They wouldn't, because they might jinx it. A person checks their horoscope before making a major decision. A person keeps a lucky object nearby during uncertain times. A person says, I feel like this happened for a reason. At first, these all seem completely unrelated. Different beliefs, different systems, different eras, but underneath them, the same instinct keeps surfacing. The need to make uncertainty feel less random, less cold, less disconnected from meaning. And honestly, that instinct probably isn't going anywhere. The way that humans are wired is we want life around us to mean something. With superstition, you're able to not only assign meaning to different things, but you feel like you're able to control what that meaning is in some way, shape, or form. Uncertainty itself is not going anywhere. No amount of technology can remove it. No amount of information can remove it. People will wake up every day not knowing what's going to happen, who they might lose, whether things are going to work out, whether the future that they imagine will actually arrive. That emotional tension remains constant. And whenever humans face uncertainty, they start searching for a pattern. Not because they're weak, not because they're foolish, because the mind naturally wants orientation. It wants coherence. It wants events to connect together in ways that feel emotionally survivable. That's why superstition keeps evolving instead of disappearing. Ancient people feared spirits entering the body during a sneeze or a yawn. Modern people fear negative energy. Ancient people carried protective objects. Modern people sometimes carry crystals. Ancient people looked for signs in the stars. Modern people still do. The symbols changed. The emotional architecture underneath them barely changed at all. And maybe that realization is slightly uncomfortable because it means modern people aren't nearly as separate from ancient superstition as they often imagine themselves to be. After all, the vocabulary has become more sophisticated. The presentation has become more personalized. But the emotional instinct remains deeply recognizable. People still want assurance, don't they? They still want signs. They still want to believe that uncertainty can somehow be interpreted or softened or even influenced. And maybe that desire itself is not irrational. Maybe it's simply part of the human experience. Because complete randomness, again, feels emotionally brutal. The idea that terrible things can happen for no reason at all. that good outcomes are never guaranteed, that effort doesn't always produce a reward. Those are some very difficult things to live with emotionally. So again, people create frameworks, systems, rituals, ways of interacting with uncertainty that make reality feel slightly more manageable. That's what superstition often becomes. Not really an attempt to control reality itself, but an attempt to regulate the emotional experience of uncertainty. To make waiting feel survivable. To make unpredictability feel less overwhelming. And once you see superstition through that lens, a lot of human behavior starts making more sense. Not just astrologies and not just lucky numbers, but all kinds of rituals that people create around uncertain situations. Even very modern ones. Refreshing your phone repeatedly while waiting for a text. Checking flight trackers obsessively before a loved one lands. Rereading old conversations, looking for hidden meaning. What did they mean by that? What were they not saying in this text? Watching the same comfort show during stressful periods of time. Small rituals. Small attempts to create predictability. Small ways of feeling emotionally connected to uncertain outcomes. Again, not because the behaviors objectively change reality, but because they change how uncertainty feels internally. And maybe that's the important distinction, because superstition was probably never really about magic anyways. Not entirely. It was about discomfort. It was about vulnerability. It was about the deeply human experience of not knowing what happens next. And once we're able to grasp that, superstition stops feeling like some strange relic from the past. It starts feeling more like a mirror, something woven quietly into modern life, into psychology, into relationships, into our culture, into the way people emotionally navigate uncertainty every single day. And maybe that's why superstition keeps surviving every generation. It's not because people refuse to let go of old beliefs, but because uncertainty keeps creating the exact emotional conditions that produce them. Again, as long as people experience hope, fear, waiting, grieving, anticipation, love, they're going to be searching for meaning. They're going to be searching for reassurance. They're going to be searching for patterns that make uncertainty feel less unbearable. And maybe the rituals themselves were never the most important part.